to see you. And thanks for joining. Yeah, so as Julian said, actually what I'm going to talk to you about today is a project that I've been working on for a few years with a colleague of mine who's former Bournemouth University, but now at El Rosario University in Bogota in Colombia, called Matthew Charles. So all of the work I'm presenting today is very much our joint venture, but we tend to sort of present in different venues and different spaces to share with you this developing idea around story listening. And I think one thing I'd like to say today is that in no way are we saying that this is some sort of definitive approach to anything. We're not trying to replace storytelling. And also it's very much an emergent idea for us. So I would love really to work with you this afternoon on hearing your ideas on it and what your take is on it as well, what your thoughts are about it. So as Julian said, it's a participatory arts project working with former child soldiers and young survivors of conflict in Colombia, and it is ongoing, and we're working towards hopefully making a small contribution to the UN goal of ending all child recruitment by 2025, which now is alarmingly close, really. And today we'll be engaging with themes of transformation, agency, and imagination. So hopefully themes which are interesting to a wide range of you. This methodology of story listening, which we're developing, came through a project. I did ask the students, perhaps you might have a chance to watch the film, but in a moment I'm just going to show you a 2-minute trailer we made for the film to give you a little flavour of it if you haven't managed to watch it. And Julian's dropping the link to the full film, which is about half an hour long, in the chat. So in the case of Colombia, thinking about alternative futures, which is what I'm interested in talking about today, means working to build peace and reconciliation after over 50 years of internal armed conflict. And for former child soldiers and for people caught up in the violence, it can be very difficult for them to reintegrate into their communities for fear of stigmatization and exclusion. And this can lead to feelings of low self-efficacy in those young people, of worthlessness. And clearly then the dangers of re-recruitment are incredibly high. Because they have left their community to join an armed group and therefore are often not allowed back in. So the key output from the project, as I've alluded to already, was an animated documentary called El Árbol del Amor, the Tree of Love. You can see the poster here that the young people created for their film. And it explores the world of forced recruitment through the stories of young former child soldiers and other young people who've experienced violence and lived in violent contexts. And it's a collage of their experiences. It's 25 different stories that we pulled together. And they are represented in these main characters of Sek, the boy, his name means sun. And Sek is from Nasa culture, which I'll talk to you about in a moment, and Arte, moon, the girl here, seen in the poster. And it was shaped, this whole project, this whole film was shaped by this story listening methodology. So I will play you briefly I'll just bring up the link to, I'm doing it this way because my embed didn't work. Here's the link to the trailer.
Puede que ustedes no sepan, pero les voy a contar la verdad, lo que la guerra hizo con toda mi comunidad.
Aprendimos a convivir con la guerra y así mismo se acostumbró a nuestra tierra.
So that gives you a sense, hopefully, of the nature of the film. The drawings are quite primitive because they were all designed by the children, by the young people, and also they animated it. They did everything. So that's part of this immersive approach that we're very keen on. But I want to take you to two different communities, and the first of these is where we actually made the film with the young people. They were aged 9 to 24, and we were in Hambalo in the Cauca region of Colombia, which has been described as one of the country's spaces of death. It's home to the Nasa people, who are an indigenous community, and it sits very much on the margins, as you can imagine from that description, a community grappling with the reintegration of child soldiers on a regular basis and those problems of stigma and stereotype. It's a semi-autonomous territory. They have their own guard, their own justice system, and it can be extremely difficult for outsiders to get in. It's very closed off. We went in under the aegis of the Norwegian Refugee Council. And these communities have been really badly affected by the conflict, and armed groups still continue to take advantage of them, even in the so-called peace, which is prevalent now. They're poor and they're isolated. They're ripe pickings for criminal gangs and non-state armed groups. They also have a different belief system, and this is really important because natural harmony for them is about the earth. It's about being very close to nature. So when a child joins an armed group or goes to fight as a soldier, they are not only ripped from the community, but physically from the soil, from the earth. And so this is how stigma and stereotype emerges, is given a rise to, because it's a real problem for the community, the idea of having these children back. But often they leave and they go into the armed groups in order to protect their families. They believe they're doing something good for their families. So recruitment's a direct response to keep their families safe, but can also be a response to stigma, i.e. they go back into the gangs because they have been pushed out from their communities. So it's a really challenging context. And our project was located in those circumstances. We wanted to try and work as well on a community level to try and fight this issue of stigmatization, and then to build a sort of community narrative through the film whereby mutual understanding would develop. And that can be seen quite often as the foundation of peace. It can be the very beginning of recovery, a community narrative. And here are various references for you if you wish to pursue this idea further and research it further. So there are a few images from the film, which if you get a chance to watch it, I would urge you to, you get a little bit of a sense of how they illustrated the film. I think it's really important that they are capturing the everyday in this film. So it is, and peace, of course, peace building is very much located in the everyday rather than the extraordinary. So I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. But next I want to take you to my other community for the afternoon, which is Ben Poster. Now, this is a community of children which is in Bogota. These are children who are all at risk of recruitment, so much so they cannot be with any families that they may have left. And it's an amazing, inspiring place, which is led by the children themselves. It's a refuge, but it's a community which is autonomous and led by them. It's a safe space, a sanctuary for the young people. So after the film was made in Cauca, which my colleague Matt worked on the ground with other colleagues in Colombia to create, I went out to Bogota and we brought the young people out of Cauca with their teacher to Bogota, and they met these children in Ben Poster and they screened their film to those children. And they all sat in a circle afterwards and talked about it, and we ran a workshop where the young children from the Ben Poster refuge wrote letters to the characters in the film, and people that they'd identified with, or themes or ideas that they had identified with in the film. So we have a film that's made through the process of listening and sharing stories, and I'm going to talk to you a bit more about the process of making that film in a moment. And then the collage of those experiences presented in the film to the Ben Poster children was responded to by them in this process of intragenerational sharing. And through doing this, we were seeking to avoid what I would call top-down processes of peace building, where we go in with our global North Western models of what peace looks like, but offering instead a more immersive process whereby they could imagine their own alternative futures and also share their experiences. So negative identities are often talked about as arising from violent imaginaries, and we were trying to mitigate this and to move them into a different space, if you like. That just gives you a physical, visual illustration of the sorts of letters that they wrote after they had viewed the film. Okay, so to go back to Cauca for a moment, just to consider the oral traditions that are there around storytelling for one moment, which are featured in the film. Now, they are very much storytellers. So you might say, well, why don't we just talk about storytelling? But there's a moment in the film where you see the young sitting with the elders around the fire called the tulpa. And this is a fire made of 3 stones, which is the grandmother, the mother, and the father are represented in these stones. And quite often the elders hold sway in this forum. They will tell their stories, but the young children don't feel that they're listened to. And in fact, the teacher that we work with in Cauca and the young people testify to this, that they would often share ideas and stories and experiences around this fire, but nobody really listened, and they were often asked to be quiet. So through a sort of observational and ethnographic process, we have developed this idea of story listening, because it was evident to us that storytelling was not necessarily going to be the answer. And that means also we didn't use interviews as our methodological approach, as a method that we employed for making the film. We used different ways of the young people writing their stories and sharing their stories within the workshops. Finally, I would say that this idea of forming bonds then develops as a result of story listening, because this is a much more active process, if you like, than telling, and stories are not always listened to, as the example of sitting around the fire shows, where even though they're being told. So just to talk you through the 3 workshops briefly. The first of these was the narrative workshop, which was really the most important. And this was where we were also seeking to build trust with the young people. And that was a really challenging thing. And I'm happy to take questions about ethics. I don't have a lot of time to go into ethics in this talk, but I can definitely talk to you more about the ethics of the whole project. So we used lots of different methods to try and build trust. Human cartography, where we physically drew human shapes, and the young people would map their experiences of violence to their bodies. We encouraged them to write poetry, to draw drawings, and also to talk to each other. Clearly there was a lot of mistrust even between the members of the group, because not all of them had been child soldiers, and not all of them knew, even though they were from the same community, that some of their friends had actually done this. So they were learning things about each other for the first time, and that obviously was also a very difficult thing for us to navigate. So the narrative workshop was incredibly important, and out of that came 25 testimonies, 25 stories, one from each of the young people. We had 10 young people who had a diploma in animation and wanted to develop their skills. We had 10 young people who had been subject to violence and conflict through maybe abuse in the family or different experiences. And we had 5 child soldiers within this group, as I say, age 9 to 24. The remaining 2 workshops were around designing the poster that you saw on the first slide, my talk, the production of the film, and then the animation workshop was where they were animating their scenes for final production. These were each a week long, and we would do one for a week, and then we would work on the artifacts produced from that, go back in later, do the next, and the same again with the third and final. But all of this work was done by them. It was very much their film, produced by them. And I'd just like to point out that quote from Sek at the top of the slide. I think the other thing that we became very aware of was that they were resilient, these young people. They did not need us to go in and teach them how to be resilient. maybe that a greater resilience would emerge from the process of making the film with us, but actually they should not be seen as victims or perpetrators of violence for that matter. So it was very important that we understood that as researchers. But they really wanted to live somewhere peaceful, where cars had wings, so they could escape and make friends in a better place. But they lived in this world which had become, as Sek says in the film, accustomed to war. So the lead animator, who's the Colombian who worked with the young people on the ground, Fowler-Watt, she made it very clear that in the film you'll see there's a mix of animation and real life shots. So, for example, there are real tires on an animated bus. There's a real river flowing through an animated landscape. And we had to anonymize these children. They're still very much at risk. Of course, animation does offer anonymity, she says, but they really wanted you to understand that these things are true. Nothing is fictionalized in this film. And so it was really important to them, particularly as we were going to go and show this film to the Truth Commission, amongst others, which I'll talk about a bit later, that people understood that these things really had happened to them. So that was why the film was produced in this particular way. And then we move towards, through this process, our ideas around story listening and what that really looks like. And I'll just give you a moment to look at our emerging diagram here around it. So we see it as operating on all these different levels. And then I'm going to give you a few examples about how we saw it in evidence when we took the young people from Cauca out to the Ben Poster refuge to share the film, and then to hear back from those young people in that refuge. Well, firstly, we see it as operating on the individual level, the individual and autobiographical level, where the young person can build their self-efficacy. We don't talk so much about resilience because, as I said, we see them as pretty resilient, but where they can recreate experiences, go back into memory, which of course is an ethical consideration for us, in terms of not re-traumatizing them, but and then seek some sort of release and catharsis through sharing those memories with others who are listening to them. And that can build confidence in terms of the peace building process, perhaps in reinforcing in them a sense that they don't need to go back into an armed gang. Then we see the sort of shared experience between those who are similar to them in terms of having had similar experiences, but of course every experience is unique. So, for example, the Ben Poster children, where we see them sharing the stories of their experiences together and creating empathy and forming bonds as a result of that. So getting in touch with their own emotional lives and their own emotional experiences and forming bonds together as people who have had similar experiences, realizing they're not alone. And one of the young women at the Ben Poster refuge said exactly that. She just realized that she was not alone in this. Then there's that intergenerational level, which is non-shared. So that might be somebody like Matt or myself, researchers, going into this space, hearing these stories, working with the young people, having our own awareness raised, as those who were at the Truth Commission in Colombia when they saw it were also then made aware of exactly what it was like to be a child soldier. And we believe that can build a mutual understanding through being more inclusive, so perhaps knocking down some of the stigma and the stereotyping that I talked about at the beginning. And that moves me on then to this ideal for us of the community narrative. So taking the film back into the community in which it was created, for example, in Cauca, and screening it there, this idea of enlightenment, wisdom, reflection, becoming more apparent within the community as they understand perhaps why young people became soldiers and what happened to them when they did. And rather than shunning them, including them and showing them a much more benevolent and understanding and empathic attitude. And then hopefully that would mean that reconciliation and peace could be promoted through this growth of mutual understanding, and stereotype, as it says here, would be avoided. So this is our nascent model of story listening, but the way that we see it developing. So to give you a few examples of that from the film, Arte says in the film that life wasn't fun and people didn't seem to care about them. She talks about how they'd previously been unheard. And there we see the positive impact of them sharing their stories and this idea of agency, which again I mentioned at the beginning. And Sek says in the film, who would say the alphabet would have helped me to get off my chest all the thoughts I felt I would never forget, that with words I would undo them. So in telling his story and sharing his experiences, and then those being presented as a collage, Sek, of course, is a fictional character, but a collage of the experiences that we heard. He feels that language is unlocked, if you like, an opportunity for him to imagine a better life and also to feel empowered to achieve that. So that sense of catharsis and the potential for peace building being released is really evident within the characters of the film, the stories that you hear. Then I mentioned this is unpacking the model for you now, really, with examples and quotes. But, you know, this idea, it was great to be able to voice our fears and thoughts, to have the opportunity to do that. You know, we all know we live in conflict, but we're silent about it. They keep safe through silence, but actually they realise that if they talk about it, not only is it better for their mental well-being, but also it means that they move into spaces where others can hear them and listen to them. Clearly around the tulpa, around that 3 stones of a fire, this was not happening. But within the spaces that were created through the filmmaking, they were able to do that. I talked a little bit about this when looking at the model, this idea of how the listener can benefit. And what we saw in Ben Poster was that they did talk about feeling less shame and less guilt for the experiences they had had, because within the film and talking to the children from Cauca, they realised this was happening to other children elsewhere, even though but in very different parts of the country. And then that sense of mutual healing can perhaps start through the writing and sharing of stories and the growing sense of empathy, so important to building peace and reconciliation. And then that non-shared experience, people like us in the West, or those living in their mansions in Bogota who'd never experienced the conflict in the same way, that chance to see different perspectives and to realise the impact of their own actions through excluding, and then moving towards that community narrative, which is so crucial. And that the idea that people from different places would understand, and I think that can mean, beyond the boundaries of Colombia too. We wouldn't make any great claim for story listening or for this project. It's a very unique experience, but we have done other things since within the country to develop the ideas, particularly working with children who are at very high risk in very high risk areas now. But within the community, I think we think that what you can do through this sort of process is to avoid oversimplification of victim and perpetrator, for example, understand how conflict affects the whole community, get the community to hold a mirror up to itself, promote in a sort of Brechtian way almost, promote understanding through identifying the structural causes of violence and work then to actively change it. So that idea that not only are you understanding more, but you're doing something about it. And our sense is that through this process of what we call story listening, we're not only creating community narratives, but they're being shared and received in that way. So through public screenings, through obviously the young people going back into their community and talking about it and being listened to, and also in a deeper level, creating emotional fusion between people and forming bonds, which mean then that understanding is hopefully more lasting, and building a sense of collective memory and working towards is more of a grassroots peace formation and or conflict transformation. And this sort of work is done in other areas. We've seen it done in the Eastern Europe, seen it done in Northern Ireland, but often is talked about as storytelling. And so we're just looking at this slightly more immersive process, which I've described to you through the creation of the film, the way in which the film's created. And any other artifacts we've created since, we're using the same approach. We're not going in and interviewing people, we're doing things a bit differently. So this is the foyer of the Truth Commission, and the young people from Cauca talked about their film and then screened it at the Truth Commission, and it was accepted as the first audiovisual testimony that they had taken. Normally they were sitting in rooms making notes as people talked to them. It's a very much a written sort of culture as well, And so that was an amazing moment for the young people to see the impact. And in fact, it is this impact, rather than the outputs, it's this impact which is of the greatest interest to us, in terms of hopefully making, in a small way, some sort of change. So the community and the personal narratives, of course, are very much related here. You start with that personal, autobiographical experience, and then build it out into the wider context. And through sharing what we call their troubling autobiographies, and building empathy in the different ways and layers that we have described, hopefully then working towards empathy on a wider scale, and building strength and resilience and reconciliation and peace within the country. So just a couple of examples of what the letters from the Ben Poster children, I'm just closing this, sorry, my thing is flicking around now. What the Ben Poster children wrote to the characters. So this first letter's to Arte, and who wrote it, the young person who wrote it said, "Thank you for allowing me to rewrite my story." So through watching the film, she was writing, it was a young woman writing to Arte, the character in the film, who is of course that collage of experiences, thanking her for enabling her to think about having a different life, imagining a different and alternative future, and feeling free, as she says, to continue flourishing, growing and becoming stronger. Never again should another child or teenager be sent to war. And then a letter written to Sek, urging him to be brave and to work to build a better community. So that understanding in these young people that through sharing their troubling autobiographies, these individuals had the opportunity to do something on a community level. So I just want to explain to you the heart at the bottom of the tree here, and that the heart pumps within the film. You'll see it pumping and loudly. And this was all, again, the young people, the children's idea in the Cauca community. And this is the idea of post-traumatic growth for us, the idea that you can go through the most incredible experiences, very difficult experiences, and come out the other side stronger. It's a very strong idea within trauma literacy and trauma literature. And we felt it was very evident here in the process that I've described to you that the young people were going through. They came in as pretty resilient, but that resilience was definitely built through the process of sharing their stories. They were encouraged through the self-efficacy and the growth in confidence that came about as a result of that to resist re-recruitment into non-state armed gangs, as it now would be. And then they would persist in that because they really could believe in and imagine an alternative future and continue to desist and also educate others in doing so, and through sharing their experiences. And that they really owned this film. You know, they screened it with pride in a number of different spaces in Bogota in the week that they were with us. But the Ben Poster experience, I think, was a particularly compelling one because those were children who really were at extreme risk. So my final slide is about thinking about how new imaginaries can be created through this process. And it's the transformative potential released by the story listening experience that really interests us. Something that we observed in a very tangible way. And I think these letters are the sort of evidence of it, if you like. So the final one is about the friendship between Arte and Sek, the love they have for each other within the film, the tree of love, the beautiful tree of love they stand beneath where secrets are shared. And for friendships and are formed and love affairs are conducted. And in the letter it says that they say it's beautiful when there's a friendship that nothing and nobody can separate, helping and protecting one another, the friendship everyone should have. So there's that idea of this is something that we should be building for everyone and thanking them for the example they show us. So I'd like to end on that thought, really, that, you know, that there was real hope for the young people in both communities, I think, to feel strengthened by the process of sharing with each other through the story listening experience. So I'd love to discuss this further with you and answer any questions. If there's anything that hasn't been clear as well, please do ask, because I have had to move through this quite quickly to speak to you today, but the film is half an hour long, so sadly I can't show you the whole thing. But thank you for listening.